Reconstruction, take two, action. Hey everybody, this one is on Congressional Hey, there's my car keys. This one is about Congressional Reconstruction. It happens right after presidential Reconstruction, when President Johnson declares that Reconstruction's over and Congress says, I don't think so, we're going to take over here. First of all, right up here, I've got these boxes, these red boxes. That's going to help us to answer the questions. There's question 1, it's posed. And so here's our overview of Congressional Reconstruction. So the radical Republicans in Congress, they disagreed with President Johnson and stated that more work needed to be done to bring African Americans closer to full citizenship. They said Reconstruction's not over. So Congress passed a series of bills designed to help those African Americans gain their equal rights. President Johnson vetoed them all. Congress was not happy with this reaction from President Johnson, but they did have enough votes to typically override those vetoes. So, again, up here, there's our next question. What 2 new laws passed by Congress helped them achieve the same? The first one is called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act was a law that declared freemen to be full citizens with the same civil rights as whites. Civil rights are rights that everybody is granted simply because they're born as humans. That's the way I look at civil rights. And so this declared that freedmen should get those civil rights. The next one was called the 14th Amendment. Again, there's the question posed above. The 14th Amendment is now the 14th change to our U.S. Constitution. We just saw the 13th in the last video. Now the 14th Amendment was ratified 3 years later in 1868. This granted full citizenship to anyone born in the United States and guaranteed all citizens equal protection under the law. It did not matter whether they had been enslaved before, what their race was. They have full citizenship as long as they were born in the United States. That's what our 14th Amendment guarantees. Well, these bills from Congress were designed to help African Americans, and this was the reaction from President Johnson. I didn't mention extending the Freedmen's Bureau, but in the last video I talked about the Freedmen's Bureau, this agency that was established to help African Americans with just typical necessities and needs. So Johnson's reaction to extending the Freedmen's Bureau was veto. He used his veto stamp. Civil Rights Act of 1866, veto. He vetoed that one also. And the 14th Amendment, he can't veto, but he can oppose it. And so he does that. Well, Congress's reaction to this, when the Freedmen's Bureau was vetoed, veto override. They had enough votes to be able to override the president. Civil Rights Act of 1866, veto override. And the 14th Amendment, they still were able to pass the 14th Amendment. So even though President Johnson and Congress didn't necessarily get along, those bills that benefited African Americans were still able to be passed. So this one is now another question that were posed. Describe the relationship between President Johnson and Congress. You choose a word, maybe a snazzy adjective that would describe that relationship. And no, bad and sad are not snazzy. So choose a snazzy adjective to describe that relationship. Okay. The next event is called the Military Reconstruction Act. In the Military Reconstruction Act, Congress sends the military down to the South. They divide up those southern states into 5 military districts, and each district is governed by an army general. That means they're not giving that power of the government back to Southerners yet. They're having the U.S. Army in charge of those districts in the South. This map right over here, this one right here, is showing us where those 5 military districts are. You see 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th district. Well, those new governments are now created with blacks and whites in office. This image right here shows you the first colored senator and representatives. Again, I talk about in my class that the term colored is used in history, but it is not an appropriate term to be used any longer. You wouldn't call somebody that, but I'm just describing what it says on this painting right here, or on this image. And a third part of the Military Reconstruction Act is that Southerners who had supported the Confederacy were denied their right to vote. They lost their right to vote as a result of serving in the Confederacy. And we know that Lincoln wouldn't have wanted that, because Lincoln said, with malice or hatred toward none. He wanted to help those who had borne the battle. And it looks like they decide to use a heavy hand and really harm those former Confederates. So would that make the Southerners feel like this? Maybe. Or this? Being denied the right to vote probably makes somebody feel a little bit more like this one right here, I would say. Okay. Then this event happens. President Johnson is impeached. We haven't had too many presidents impeached in our nation's history. President Andrew Johnson, the 17th president, is one of them. To be impeached means that formal charges are brought against the president, and he is told, or she is told, that they have been acting improperly. This quote says that President Johnson brought the high office of the President of the United States into contempt, ridicule, and disgrace, to the scandal of all good citizens. In other words, he was acting in a way that brought disgrace to the presidency. Well, why did the House impeach Johnson? They basically would say that he violated the Office of Tenure Act and fired some people that he didn't have the power to fire. But as I just read in that quote, that would be another reason. And what was the outcome of this? Well, he was impeached. The charges were brought against him. But then the next thing would be to vote for removal from the presidency. Well, it turns out he was one vote shy of removal from office. So he stays in office. They needed 2/3 of the Senate, and they didn't get that. But he did lose some political power. All right. The last event that I'd like to talk about is called sharecropping. Sharecropping is a system of farming that divided land into these small plots that could be rented out to farmers so that they could farm on them. This kind of solves one of those problems, and one of those problems for those former slaves, those now freed men, was that they didn't own property, and their skills were fairly limited on what they knew how to do, and farming was one of those skills. But they didn't have property. So, in this way, they can farm land, use those skills, and just pay somebody to rent that land. In theory, it sounds like a really good idea, but here's how it ends up working out. So here's a chart for you. Let's say that large rectangle there is a large piece of land. And the owner of that land, the former plantation owner probably, divides it up into those rectangles and then lets people rent each one of those pieces. Now those two that I already have it filled in there, that's two people that rented that farm and they paid the rent with cash. So at the beginning of the season, they pay that farm owner the money. He lets them use that land. They farm it. Whatever they grow and whatever they sell, it's their money to keep. That part of the system sounds really good. But if you couldn't afford to pay that money up front, which is pretty much all of those African Americans in the South, what they could do is they could rent the land for the season. They could plant their crops, grow them, harvest them, sell them, and then whatever money they made, 1/3 of it is paid to the landowner. Okay, so this is a little bit better than nothing. It's, allowing them to use some money and some time and some land, but they still are paying 1/3 of their crop. So if they have a really great season, they're still paying now a larger amount of rent. Okay, but some farm owners, and they could do whatever they wanted, some would make those renters, or those sharecroppers, I should say, pay half of their crop. Now here's the thing. Those sharecroppers not only need to pay the rent, but they also had to borrow money from the plantation owner to buy food and seeds and tools and supplies and to pay their own rent for a home. So all these things that they needed to pay, and it ends up that they often would owe the landowner more money at the end of the season than they actually made. And so the landowner would say, well, now, next season, you have to farm on this land again. You cannot leave until you've paid off that debt. And rarely would any of these sharecroppers earn enough money to pay back that debt in the first place. So some people say that this is somewhat of slavery by another name. Those former slaves could not leave that land until they paid off that debt. And they were never going to be able to pay off that debt because that farmer, that landowner, that plantation owner did not want them to ever pay off that debt. So sharecropping leads a lot of sharecroppers into poverty and further debt. Let me illustrate this for you. Here's 3 images, 3 photographs. There's A, B, and C. I'd like you to take a second and think about which one of those you think are sharecroppers and which one you think is showing slaves. I'll give you a second. A, B, or C. Okay. If you said that any of those are slaves, you are wrong. All of those photos are sharecroppers. There's a photo of sharecroppers in Georgia in 1910, photo of sharecroppers of Georgia in 1907, and a photo of sharecroppers in 1898. All of those images are of sharecroppers, and those images look a lot like slavery. The one difference is you can see in that top image up at the corner there that there are some white sharecroppers as well. This is true. There were white sharecroppers who would rent that land and sometimes also fall into that same system of poverty and debt. Okay. So that was Reconstruction phase of Congressional Reconstruction. We're going to Southern Reconstruction next. See ya.